Story 1. When I last left off, I was working at a dirty factory on the campus where I was contracted. I'd been there for a few years, but I started developing lung issues. Despite how filthy the job was, I actually liked it. However, I decided to apply for a different position at a much less hazardous facility. In this new role, I began floating between buildings as needed, which was incredibly convenient for my union work. The only downside was that the employees at this new facility had a different shift in their contract, which meant I had to clock in at 6 a.m. every morning. I'm not a morning person, so this almost made me reconsider, but I figured it would give me more flexibility with my university schedule. So I went for it, rearranged my classes accordingly, and worked there for a bit over a year with no issues. The only small complication was that I was one of 2 people staffing this building from my department. The other person, a lady, had suffered a serious medical event and was on indefinite leave, leaving me alone most of the time. At first, that was fine, I could keep up with the work. At the time, I was really into fitness, going to the gym every day after work in class. I had no problem with the physical labor at my previous building, nor with running between buildings at this new one. I even had to drive between locations to assist with tasks, but that wasn't an issue either. However, out of nowhere, I started having dizzy spells. Since I was alone on site, I couldn't slow down, so I just powered through. The first time I fainted, I didn't even realize what had happened. I thought I had just tripped and hit the ground so fast that I couldn't process it. The second time, though, there was a witness, and it became a big deal. An ambulance was called, and I had no explanation for what had happened. As a result, I was placed on short-term disability until I could get clearance from a cardiologist. Turns out, it was just a case of postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome POTS, but the contract required I get medical clearance before returning to work. I ended up being out for about 6 months, which I wasn't happy about. When I was finally cleared to return, I found out that they had given my job to someone else, and they assigned me to a different facility I didn't want to work at, with a different shift. This created several problems. First, I had scheduled my university classes around the job I was hired for, not the new shift they randomly assigned to me. Second, they weren't allowed to give away my job while I was on short-term disability without my consent, which I certainly hadn't given. Third, they couldn't change my shift without my agreement, as this was clearly protected in the contract. The woman who had taken my job was a new hire, but she had bid for my position through the proper channels. She had taken the role to ensure her shift didn't disrupt her childcare. Moving her to the job they'd shifted me to would mean she wouldn't have anyone to take care of her child after preschool. I felt for her, and I decided I'd file a grievance to make sure both of us got what we wanted. After lengthy negotiations, plenty of cursing mostly from me toward the supervisors for pulling this nonsense, I agreed to let the woman keep my previous job, but only if they met my demands at the new facility. First, they wanted me to downgrade from a general labor position to an office cleaner. I flatly refused and insisted that they find me a role within my current job title. If they needed more cleaners, that was their problem. Second, I insisted I would not change my shift. I didn't care if I was the only person out of 50 clocking in at 6 a.m. It was non-negotiable. Third, I found out that they'd moved the woman into my role without paying her the correct rate. She had been paid just over minimum wage for doing labor duties, so I demanded that they pay her every penny she was owed in back pay, but at the proper rate this time. Supervision had no way to argue with me, so while I wasn't entirely happy, it was a small victory. Then came another battle. The facility had strict rules about set break times, which were outlined in the contract. Unfortunately, there wasn't any specific language allowing for flexibility. On my first day back, I discovered this was the only facility that also had a mandatory shift meeting at the start of the day. I arrived at work and clocked in by 6, and by the time I put my lunch in the fridge, turned on the lights, and unplugged the equipment, it was 6:25 and then, I had to walk nearly a mile through the building to attend the 7 a.m. shift meeting, which I thought was absurd. I asked if I could skip the meeting, given the long walk, but my supervisor smugly insisted that I had to attend. Me, do you remember my hours? Supervisor, I roll. Okay, if you insist. So, here's what my day looked like. 6 a.m. Arrive, turn on lights, unplug equipment. 6:25 a.m. Walk to the meeting. 7 a.m. Attend the meeting. 7:20 to 7:30 a.m. Walk back to my work location. 8 a.m. Take my scheduled break. For the first 2 hours of my shift, I couldn't get any work done. By the time I finished my break, I still had to prep the equipment, check it for safety, replace any parts if needed, and organize my work orders. Then, I was on lunch at 10 a.m. In short, my day consisted mostly of walking to meetings and taking breaks, leaving very little time for actual work. When my supervisors came by a few days later, ready to write me up, I handed them my detailed schedule. Me, you told me my break times were non-negotiable. You also insisted I attend the meeting in the other building. They were absolutely dumbfounded. They had inadvertently forced me into a schedule that prevented me from getting more than about 4 hours of work done in an 8-hour day. And the kicker? They couldn't take it back without setting a precedent that exceptions could be made at this facility. I could see their gears turning as they tried to figure out a way to punish me, but I had done exactly what they had ordered. So, I followed their instructions to the letter, and they ended up giving me a job that prevented me from doing more than half a day's work. But I still got paid for the full day. It also gave me more time to work on union paperwork and catch their contract violations, as I was stationed closer to the main office. In the end, I like to think I made their lives just a little more difficult, all because they tried to mess with my work location and hours without realizing what they were doing. That position became a running joke for the last few years I worked there. Story 2. I thought I was done dealing with my family. I told them to leave and never come back, and for a few weeks I didn't hear from them. But then, out of nowhere, they showed up again, and things were worse than ever. I was working a 6-day stretch, but it worked out because I had extra time off before my vacation, which I'd been preparing for. I was looking forward to some peace and quiet. Normally, when someone from my family visits, it's usually just my sister or my mom. But yesterday, all 3 of them, my mom, my dad, and my sister, showed up on my doorstep. It was a nightmare and completely ruined my day. And they came carrying paperwork. Before they even stepped inside, my sister started with, "From your last email, I just need to clear something up. You are not allowed to hate me. I'm your older sister." I responded, "Yes, I can. You're not in control of my feelings." At this point, I was petty enough to be a terrible host. I didn't offer them anything to drink or make them comfortable. I just asked, "Why are you here?" My sister declared that she needed my help and that I was going to help her. She didn't ask, just demanded. Then my dad chimed in. "Your sister has been thinking and doing some research, and she's figured out what she wants to do with her life. She's decided on a career." I glanced over at my mom, who was rubbing her temples, looking like she knew this was ridiculous, but was just along for the ride. I took a deep breath and said, "I thought you were going to get your real estate license." My sister replied, "That's my last resort, but I've been watching videos about different healthcare jobs. I saw one nurse and thought, nursing is easy. Then I saw a vlogger who's a doctor, and I think I want to be a doctor. Then I'll become your boss." At that moment, I heard a voice in my head, like Brenda Strong from Desperate Housewives narrating. It was precisely at this moment that Op realized the one thing his family's money couldn't buy was common sense. Op then realized his family was completely out of touch with reality, and this conversation was about to get both infuriating and mildly amusing. Yes, I'm an Desperate Housewives fan. It's a bit past my time, but I stumbled upon it by accident, bought the entire series, and binge-watched it. As I was reflecting on this, I received a text from one of my mom's phones, which I forgot to block. It said, "I'm trying, but your dad is making it hard. Go for it." So, I did. Well, even if you somehow made it through medical school and became a doctor, you would never be my boss. It doesn't work like that. Now, what exactly do you think I'm going to help you with? She slapped a folder down on the table and opened it to show me a pile of papers. College applications. I was dumbfounded. You're planning to go into the hardest profession in the world, medicine, and you want my help with college applications. If you think this is so easy, you should be able to handle it yourself. Do you even know what it takes to become a doctor? I opened the folder and saw her high school transcripts. For a brief moment, I wondered if she was serious about this since she'd gone through the trouble of collecting documents. I looked at the transcripts and laughed. See these grades? I pointed to the C's and D's. No college will accept these. You'll have to start all over, begin at a community college, get an associate degree with a focus on math and science before any university will even consider you for a pre-med program. That's 2 to 3 years. Then, you'll need 4 years of pre-med. After that, there's the medical college admission test, which you have to pass with a high score. Then 4 years of medical school, and after that, you'll need to pass several licensing exams, complete a residency, and specialize. You're looking at a minimum of 11 years of schooling, not even counting the time for your associate degree. She shrugged. If I want it bad enough, I'll get it like everything else I want. I sighed. This isn't like buying a new purse or getting your nails done. Your instructors won't care about your personal life. Their job is to turn you into a doctor, and they won't make exceptions if you have vacation plans or appointments. And if you get bad grades and go running to mom and dad to fix it, the professors will resent you even more. Then, they'll do everything they can to fail you. At this point, my dad, who had been pretty quiet, chimed in with a question that really set me off. What's wrong? Up? Afraid of a little sibling rivalry? For some reason, that comment made me furious. What sibling rivalry? There's no competition because I've already done everything. I went to school, got good grades, and have been working for 8 years. Meanwhile, you raised her and let me be raised by a nanny. He hasn't worked a day in her life, and she thinks she's going to become a doctor. I pointed at the vacuum cleaner lying in the middle of the living room. Do you even know what that thing is or how to use it? And by the way, if you go through with this ridiculous plan, I will not help you with any of it, just like I'm not helping with these college applications. I don't know what came over me. Normally, I'm much more composed, but the minute my sister said, nursing is easy, and I'll become your boss, I just snapped. 23 years of frustration with my family came pouring out. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter. To my parents, I was just a problem they had to manage, and they never thought they did anything wrong in how they raised us. Finally, I stood up and told them to leave. I'm going on vacation Tuesday, and you've already taken up too much of my time. You need to go, I've got a lot to do. Story 3. To preface, the scenario involves my roommate, let's call her Callie, her ex, let's call him Tweaky Majit, myself, Tweaky's fling, Nikki, and my roommate's dog, an adorable blue-nose pitty, let's go with Derpy. Keep in mind, I myself am 25, Callie is 25 as well, but Tweaky Majit is 19. This will be relevant later. Now, this story begins with my roommate. She had just gotten out of an exhausting, but not necessarily abusive relationship, and she was on the lookout for something casual while she regained her independence and reclaimed her life. Unfortunately, Tweaky Majit came around and made himself at home in our house. At first, it wasn't too bad. We're all moderate herbal enthusiasts, and he knew the right people, so it seemed like a fair give and take, considering we didn't pay for much green throughout the time he was essentially squatting. But he put forth nothing when it came to groceries and bills. Now my roommate was far enough removed from her previous relationship at this point to be fiercely protective of her independence. But given the age difference, she chalked up some glaringly obvious red flags when they began to present. Tweaky got his pet name for a number of reasons, but the main one was this. He had an Adderall prescription 20 milligrams. As he was prescribed the meds, he consumed quite a few. But it quickly spiraled into a 10-pill-per-day habit first. He was just consuming, but began to inhale them off our living room table after about 2 weeks. As his habit progressed, Callie also partook, as she has a very demanding job, and the extra energy helped her through her 70-hour weeks. I believe that this is another reason why she put up with it as long as she did. As their relationship progressed, the oh-so-common side effects of stimulant misuse began to creep onto both of them: irritability, poor short-term memory, inability to accurately communicate emotions, thoughts. Since I did my best to stay out of their relationship, as it's not my place to interfere in something I know her to be smart and mature enough to handle, I never really got involved. But she and I had many deep conversations while he was out on runs. I felt like our talks were making headway until one day, Tweaky McGee went crazy and started impetuously bringing up the idea of getting a dog. Keep in mind, we live in a college town, and while we're both out of school, we work full-time in a very small 2-bedroom house. She was apprehensive at first since she was already going through the motions of cutting him off, but she had also wanted a dog for years at this point. After 2 weeks of Callie and Tweaky visiting various shelters, they decided on Derpy. Derpy was an absolutely adorable 6-month-old blue-nosed pit bull with one of the most prominent personalities I have ever seen in a dog. My family used to train dogs professionally. Incredibly playful, super smart, and the perfect demeanor for a small house with a bigger backyard. Now, only being your friendly neighborhood herbal enthusiast and not partaking in the speedy delights, I saw it for what it was, but she was blinded by the adorable pup. Tweaky knew that Callie was setting the stage to kick his behind to the curb, and thought that a dog was the perfect ball and chain for the situation, but his age and addiction caught up with him. All the paperwork and payments were made in Callie's name, including the registration paperwork, initial vet visits, professional pet sitters, toys, etc. Since she works incredibly long hours, and Tweaky essentially being a bum, he got the thought in his head that the dog was his, and when push came to shove, he could keep him. Well, the day of reckoning came after about 3 weeks of escalating early morning arguments and general irritation. And while I was at work, the breakup finally happened. Law enforcement ended up being called, but no blows were thrown. Tweaky packed all his belongings up and drove it back to his mother's, then came back, told Callie he was leaving, and took Derpy with him. At this time, the officers that showed up had no idea what had been transpiring, and let him walk off with the dog. Less than 24 hours later, Callie had made so many calls to the police department/lawyers/pet advocacy groups that she had her course of action laid out. After the filing was complete, she was beyond paranoid because of the threat of retaliation. I'm a pretty big dude, 6'4" 235, so I knew I could stand my ground, but she's a tiny little thing, and I have a full-time job. In my state, any disputes regarding animals are to be settled in civil court, and the pets are treated as property. Now, I don't know about y'all, but pets are family, and do not deserve to be treated on the same base as property. The next day, she had filed a civil suit in an attempt to get Derpy back. At her first court date, she presented all the evidence of her ownership of Derpy, as well as the resources she has available to her in order to provide the best level of care for the pup. Tweaky countered with a slew of baseless accusations, essentially claiming that she had been abusive to Derpy, false, and that she doesn't have the time nor resources to properly take care of him, also false. Unfortunately, the civil court system tends to draw these things out. The court eventually ruled in her favor and ordered Tweaky to return Derpy. But when the officers turned up, apparently Derpy had run away. Before this, she was only trying to get Derpy back, and not really seeking any financial compensation punishment. By this time approx. 2 months after the breakup, which is nonsense on its own, he had already been in and out of a relationship with another woman, Nikki. Nikki had been around and heard about the court situation, but didn't know the other party. Once she found out it was Callie who Tweaky had wronged, she started messaging Callie, telling her a bunch of info about Derpy, as they were friends back in the day. It turns out that in the time since the breakup, Tweaky had been staying with his mother, an honest-to-goodness hoarder with about 10 square feet of usable space in her apartment. Tweaky was also unable to take Derpy out on walks or on pup play dates due to the fact that there was still a return order for Derpy. One day, he took Derpy to his supplier's house, who also has 2 pitties of his own. However, Derpy is in his teenage stage and began getting fresh with one of the other pits and ended up getting pretty brutally attacked. Since the return order was still in effect, and the info about him and the dog was given to every vet within 50 miles, he couldn't take him to get treatment. Tweaky also made a deal with this supplier to essentially exploit Nikki, which was one of the many reasons she was on our side. Upon hearing this, Callie, now off the uppers and much more clear-headed, absolutely lost it. She went to her lawyer to see if there was anything she could do to expedite the return of Derpy. Turns out she had a few options. Cut to today. Tweaky has officially been charged with felony theft and animal abuse and neglect charges, and they're wrapping up the legal process with pleas and other legal whatnot. He faces up to 8 years in prison, and if he doesn't return Derpy within 1 week from today, he will receive the maximum sentence. There is also a separate case in the works from Nikki regarding the whole shady exploitation situation he tried to pull, as well as unsurprisingly charges for possession manufacturing with intent to distribute sugar and nose candy. Part of me feels bad for him because he absolutely ruined the rest of his life at such a young age. But Callie and I both know that he wasn't going to get any better regardless. He had his chance, and he squandered it. Story 4. I worked for a well-known global company for 9 years, though I won't name it. I was employed in one of its divisions, and over time, I worked my way up from a tech position to a higher role in national support. I excelled in that position and was eventually promoted to a co-operator role, which I shared with a close friend. We still keep in touch, have lunch, and chat often. As part of the job, I was trained on in-house dispatch software developed by one of the company's software engineers. The system used codes for various areas and states, and though it was complicated, it worked well for him. However, there was no documentation or manual for the software. The guy who held the position before me trained me for a month before he left the company, and I took meticulous notes to avoid mistakes. Shortly after, the developer who built the software passed away, leaving me as the only person who knew how to operate it. As a result, taking vacations became nearly impossible because no one else was trained on the system. I repeatedly asked for a backup to be trained, but every request was denied. I could only take short, 2-day vacations, even though I had a month-long honeymoon coming up. Still, no backup was approved. When my co-operator and I took over the department, it was in rough shape. Repair turnarounds averaged about 8 days, frustrating customers who depended on our machines for daily operations. Together, we brainstormed solutions and managed to reduce the turnaround to just 2 days, making our customers much happier. This put extra pressure on logistics to get parts to technicians overnight, but the logistics manager was supportive and hired additional staff to handle the workload. Everything seemed to be going well. Our customer base grew, and our satisfaction ratings were consistently high. But then things took a turn for the worse. Our manager, aiming for a promotion, needed to fill his position. Naturally, both my co-operator and I applied since we knew how the department operated. Despite our qualifications, we were both passed over in favor of the manager's friend, someone from logistics who had no experience in our division or in any technical role. Once this guy, now my new manager, stepped in, he immediately wanted to change everything. He proposed adjustments to reduce the strain on logistics, but my co-operator and I protested. His changes would slow down repairs and make our customers unhappy. Despite our objections, he insisted we implement his ideas. We refused, arguing that it would harm the company's performance, but he wasn't having it. I even emailed his superiors to explain the negative impact these changes would have, but our concerns were ignored. Our refusal to comply didn't sit well with a new manager. He saw me as the main instigator and, 1 week later, I was called into a meeting with him, his manager, and HR. They informed me that I was being demoted from co-operator to dispatcher for being uncooperative and not a team player. Fine, I thought. Less responsibility, same pay sounded good to me. As a dispatcher, I was now limited to dispatching calls to techs, but I could no longer assign calls myself, a task I had handled in my previous role. My co-operator handled escalations and onboarding, but he didn't know how to use the dispatch system. The next day, I sat at my desk, waiting for calls to be dispatched to me. 4 hours later, the new manager came over, frustrated, and asked why I wasn't dispatching calls. I calmly reminded him that I had been demoted and wasn't allowed to dispatch calls, as it wasn't part of my job description anymore. The realization hit him like a truck. He had made a massive mistake. Without me, no one could use the dispatch system. Neither the manager nor HR knew how the software worked, and without it, the entire department was paralyzed. Word spread quickly that no calls were being dispatched. His manager stormed in, demanding to know what was going on. It didn't take long for them to realize they had backed themselves into a corner. They called me into the conference room again and asked me to train someone else to use the system. I refused. The day ended, and I went home. The next morning, I was summoned yet again and offered my position back. They begged me to start dispatching calls. Of course, I refused the promotion, reminding them of all the reasons they had demoted me in the first place. They were beyond frustrated. At this point, they accused me of holding the company hostage and threatened to take me to court. Per my contract, I was entitled to legal representation at their expense. A few days later, I was contacted by a lawyer who explained that, although he was being paid by the company, he worked for me and couldn't act against my interests. He reassured me that they couldn't force me to accept a promotion or fire me as long as I fulfilled my basic job responsibilities. For the next month, chaos reigned. Without the dispatch system running, repairs dragged on for over 2 weeks, and customers began canceling contracts. Eventually, they demoted me again, this time to logistics. Fortunately, the logistics manager was a good friend and saw this as retaliation for the mess they had created. He told me to just sit in a corner and do whatever I wanted, understanding it wasn't my fault. We went to court, and after 2 days, the judge ruled in my favor, stating that the company couldn't force me into a role I didn't want. They also asked if I'd be willing to turn over the information for the dispatch system. Since I had thrown away my notes, I honestly told the judge I didn't have the documentation. When asked if I could recreate it, I politely refused. The judge accepted my answer, and that was that. A month later, I found a better-paying job at a new company that offered me a month off for my honeymoon. I handed in my resignation letter, detailing everything that had happened, and sent it to my manager, his manager, and the company's senior staff, including the CEO. 2 weeks after leaving, the CEO called me, apologizing for everything and informing me that the individuals involved, including my manager, his manager, and their superior, had been fired. He even offered me my old job back, but I politely declined. A few weeks after my former manager was fired, I learned from my co-operator that he had passed away from a drug overdose. Despite everything, I felt saddened by the news. No one deserves that. The division I once ran was merged into another, and about 30% of the staff were laid off or transferred. My co-operator still works there, but said things never recovered after the ordeal, and the division went downhill fast. He's planning to retire this year. Story 5. This story took place a couple of years ago. My girlfriend, some friends, and I rented a cabin in the woods for a long, relaxing weekend. To get there, we decided to take a scenic route through the mountains instead of the highway. The road had stunning landscapes as it wound through mountains and valleys, with the speed limit varying between 90, 70, and 50 kilometers per h. I typically drive near the speed limit, maybe a little below it to enjoy the view. But I would never go too slow, maybe just 10 to 15 kilometers per h below the limit at times. The road had lots of on and off ramps leading to small nearby towns, and it was a 40-kilometer stretch where passing was not allowed due to double solid lines or concrete dividers. About a kilometer into this stretch, we were the only car on the road as far as we could see. Everyone was in a great mood, excited for the weekend ahead. Enter La Douche. La Douche merged behind us from an on-ramp, driving a beaten-up pickup truck that looked like it had been cleaned with a bag of rocks. The hood was a different color from the rest of the vehicle, you know the type. Almost immediately, he started tailgating us. Apparently, going near the speed limit wasn't good enough for him. He had places to be and obnoxiousness to spread. In my rear-view mirror, I could see him waving his arms and yelling, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. I ignored him, but kept in mind that I should avoid braking hard to prevent him from rear-ending me. At his first opportunity, he crossed the double solid lines to overtake us, forcing me to ease off the gas so he could merge back in before hitting a concrete divider ahead. Unsurprisingly, once he merged, he immediately brake-checked me, or at least tried to. But since I had already slowed down, there was a decent gap between us. More arm-waving and rude gestures followed. My girlfriend and friends asked, "What's wrong with this guy?" I sighed and explained, "He's mad because I wasn't going fast enough for him." Le Douche tried brake-checking me a few more times, but I always kept a safe distance of at least 2 car lengths. At this point, everyone in the car was paying attention to him, wondering why he didn't just drive on. No one was in front of him, so if he was in such a hurry, why was he still hanging around? Not satisfied with his failed attempts to brake-check me, he slowed down to half the speed limit or less, still making rude gestures. It seemed like some twisted form of payback. He kept this up for about 20 kilometers. Eventually, cars started lining up behind us, but we weren't even mad. We enjoyed the views and the conversation while I maintained a safe distance from him. As we were creeping along, I spotted a large pothole ahead in the center left of the lane. Le Douche, trying to avoid it, hugged the center barrier to let the pothole pass under his car. I, however, moved to the right since an off-ramp was coming up. He thought I was about to exit and swerved right to block me. But as I returned to the center of the lane, he veered back. Everyone in the car wondered aloud. "What is he doing?" I said. "It looks like he's trying to annoy us as much as possible by staying ahead of us." We had a good laugh, wondering if it even counted as following when he was in front of us. Then I got an idea. I asked, "How much do you bet I can make him pay actual money for being a jerk?" My girlfriend responded, "What are you going to do?" "Don't do anything stupid. Our exit isn't far." I replied, "No worries, it's a 10-minute detour for a lifetime of satisfaction." Everyone was on board. About 2 kilometers later, an off-ramp opened up leading to a highway on-ramp. I turned on my blinker, signaling my intention to take the exit. True to form, Le Douche cut over to the exit to stay in front of me. My girlfriend, laughing, said, "Oh, I see what you're doing." Our friends were confused, so she explained, "This is going to be fun. Just get out of the car when we stop." You see, once you're on the highway on-ramp where we live, there's no turning back. You have to take the highway and go through the toll booth to get a ticket, which you use to pay when you exit based on the distance traveled. As Le Douche saw me fully commit to the exit, he floored it to reach the toll booth before us, thinking we had no choice but to follow him onto the highway. But he was wrong. Just before the on-ramp started, there was an unmarked service road leading to a nearby farm, which my girlfriend and I knew about from previous visits. It's a dirt road that runs parallel to the highway for a bit before connecting back to the scenic route. I took the service road. A few moments later, we stopped, got out of the car, and waited. Not 2 minutes passed before Le Douche slowly rolled by on the highway, looking over his shoulder, confused because we weren't behind him. I gave a quick tap on the horn. He looked in our direction, and we all burst out cheering and waving. His reaction was priceless. His face was as red as it could get as he screamed and waved his toll ticket at us through his window. Just to clarify, I made sure no other cars were around when I tapped the horn, so I wouldn't distract any other drivers. What he didn't know was that the highway on-ramp led to traffic heading in the opposite direction from where we had been driving. There were no U-turns, and the next exit was 25 kilometers away. That exit, it led back to the very start of the scenic route we had just driven through. In the end, Le Douche essentially paid to end up right where he had started, about 45 minutes ago. We continued along the service road, rejoined the scenic route, and took our exit just 2 kilometers later. We never saw him again. We had a fantastic weekend and a great story to tell.